I'm Sarah, 26, and last Saturday was supposed to be the proudest day of my sister's life, her medical school graduation. Instead, it became the day my parents publicly disowned me in front of 500 guests. What they didn't know was that I'd discovered their devastating secret 3 months earlier. While they were celebrating their perfect daughter and cutting me out of the family, I was preparing to expose the truth that would destroy everything they'd built. Sometimes revenge is a dish best served at graduation ceremonies. Before we dive into this explosive family drama, what do you think could be so devastating that it would make parents disown their own child at a graduation ceremony? Drop your wildest theories in the comments below, and don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe for more shocking family revenge stories. Trust me, you're not prepared for the nuclear bomb I dropped on my so-called family. Growing up in the Morrison household meant understanding one fundamental truth: everything revolved around my younger sister Jessica. From the moment she could walk, Jess was positioned as the family's crown jewel, destined for greatness while I existed as supporting cast in her starring role. The favoritism wasn't subtle. When we were kids, Jessica's finger paintings were framed and displayed prominently in our living room, while my artwork was briefly acknowledged before disappearing into desk drawers. Her dance recitals were attended by both parents with professional cameras, while my soccer games were lucky to get one parent scrolling through their phone on the sidelines. But it was in academics where the disparity became most obvious. Jessica showed early aptitude in science and math, which our parents, both successful doctors, saw as validation of superior genetics and parenting. Dad, a cardiac surgeon, and Mom, a dermatologist, had always dreamed of creating a medical dynasty. When Jessica expressed interest in becoming a doctor at age 12, they treated it like divine prophecy. Every family dinner became a strategy session for Jessica's medical career. They discussed which high schools had the best pre-med programs, which extracurricular activities would look impressive on college applications, and which standardized test prep courses would give her the biggest advantage. I sat at the same table, invisible, while they planned her entire future with the intensity of military strategists. When I expressed interest in art and creative writing, their response was politely dismissive. "Art is a wonderful hobby," Mom would say, "but it's not a practical career path." They enrolled Jessica in advanced science camps while suggesting I might enjoy a summer job to learn work ethic. The message was clear: her interests mattered because they aligned with their vision of success, mine were frivolous distractions from real achievement. High school amplified these patterns. Jessica's report cards were celebrated with special dinners and social media posts bragging about their future doctor. My decent grades in liberal arts subjects were acknowledged with brief nods before conversation shifted back to Jessica's latest academic triumph. When she scored in the 98th percentile on her SATs, they threw a party. When I scored in the 85th percentile, they suggested I might want to retake them. The college application process revealed the full extent of their investment disparity. Jessica applied to elite pre-med programs with our parents' full financial and emotional support. They hired private college counselors, paid for multiple test prep courses, and took time off work to visit campuses with her. When she was accepted to Johns Hopkins with a partial scholarship, they acted like they'd personally won the Nobel Prize. My college experience was entirely different. I was expected to handle applications independently, research scholarship opportunities myself, and make decisions about my future without family input. When I was accepted to a respected liberal arts college with a partial scholarship for creative writing, their response was tepid congratulations followed by concerns about student loans and job prospects. College years continued the pattern. Jessica's pre-med achievements were documented and celebrated like national holidays. Dean's List appearances, research opportunities, and MCAT scores were treated as family victories worth announcing to everyone they knew. Meanwhile, my academic accomplishments, including several writing awards and publication in literary magazines, were barely acknowledged. But it wasn't just about academics. Jessica could do no wrong in any aspect of life. When she dated, her boyfriends were welcomed like future sons-in-law, regardless of how they actually treated her. When I dated, my relationships were subjected to intense scrutiny and subtle disapproval. Jessica's career ambitions were supported unconditionally, my creative pursuits were tolerated with barely concealed disappointment. The financial investment told the real story. They paid Jessica's full tuition and living expenses, ensuring she could focus entirely on academics without working. I received partial support and worked multiple jobs throughout college to cover my remaining expenses. They justified this by claiming medical school required complete dedication, while other majors supposedly allowed time for employment. After graduation, the disparity only intensified. Jessica's acceptance to medical school was treated like a family achievement worthy of announcing in the local newspaper. They threw elaborate celebrations, posted constantly on social media, and told everyone who would listen about their daughter, the future doctor. My graduation with honors was acknowledged with a brief dinner and generic congratulations. Medical school became their obsession. They followed Jessica's progress like devoted fans, celebrating every rotation, exam score, and clinical achievement. They planned their social lives around her schedule, adjusting family gatherings and vacations to accommodate her availability. I moved to a different city for work and could go months without meaningful contact from them. The most painful part wasn't the obvious favoritism, it was the gaslighting that accompanied it. When I tried to address the imbalance, they insisted they treated both daughters equally and suggested I was imagining problems or being overly sensitive. They'd point to material things they'd bought me as evidence of equal treatment while completely ignoring the emotional and financial disparities that had shaped our entire family dynamic. They created a family mythology where Jessica was the responsible, successful daughter who made good choices, while I was the artistic dreamer who needed to be managed and guided toward more practical thinking. This narrative became so entrenched that extended family and friends accepted it without question, further reinforcing their belief in its accuracy. By the time Jessica was finishing medical school, I'd built a successful career as a freelance marketing consultant and copywriter. I'd won industry awards, built a thriving business, and achieved financial independence. But none of that mattered to my parents because it didn't fit their narrow definition of prestigious success. Jessica was still the golden child whose achievements reflected their superior parenting, while I remained the disappointment who'd failed to live up to their expectations. What they didn't know was that their golden child success story had some very dark secrets, and I was about to discover exactly how far they'd gone to protect their precious dynasty. The truth would reveal that everything they'd built their family identity around was contaminated by lies, manipulation, and potentially criminal behavior. The first hint that something was wrong came during what should have been Jessica's moment of triumph. 3 months before her medical school graduation, I received an unexpected call from my college friend Marcus, who worked as a nurse at Johns Hopkins Hospital. He was calling with concerns about Jessica that he couldn't ignore any longer. Marcus had been working with medical students during their clinical rotations and had observed some troubling patterns in Jessica's behavior. She'd been caught several times falsifying patient notes, claiming procedures she hadn't actually performed, and taking credit for diagnoses made by attending physicians. More seriously, she'd been involved in 2 medication errors that could have seriously harmed patients, but had managed to cover them up by blaming nursing staff. Initially, Marcus assumed these were isolated incidents, the kind of mistakes stressed students sometimes make. But then he witnessed Jessica stealing prescription medications from the hospital pharmacy. When he confronted her privately, she broke down and admitted she'd been struggling with addiction to stimulants for over 2 years. The addiction had started innocently enough. Like many medical students, Jessica had begun taking Adderall to handle the intense academic pressure. But what began as occasional study aid had evolved into daily dependence, then escalated to stealing stronger medications from clinical sites. She was functioning well enough to maintain her grades and clinical performance, but Marcus could see the signs of someone spiraling toward a dangerous breaking point. Marcus felt obligated to report the theft, but Jessica begged him to give her a chance to get help voluntarily. She promised to enter rehab and come clean to the medical school administration herself. Marcus agreed to wait 1 week, but when Jessica failed to follow through, he faced an impossible choice: report a colleague and potentially destroy her career, or stay silent and risk patient safety. That's when he called me. Marcus knew about our family dynamic from college and hoped I might be able to intervene where the medical school administration couldn't. He thought if Jessica had family support, she might be more willing to seek help before her addiction caused irreparable damage to her career or harmed patients. I was stunned. The golden child who could do no wrong was not only struggling with addiction but had been stealing drugs and falsifying medical records. Everything my parents believed about their perfect daughter was built on lies and potentially criminal behavior. But Marcus had more disturbing information. Through hospital gossip, he'd learned that this wasn't Jessica's first experience with academic dishonesty. There were rumors about questionable behavior during her undergraduate years, possible cheating incidents that had been quietly resolved, research misconduct that had been covered up, and a pattern of ethical shortcuts that painted a picture of someone willing to compromise integrity for achievement. Even more shocking was what Marcus had discovered about our parents' involvement. Apparently, Dad had used his professional connections to help Jessica secure certain clinical rotations and research opportunities. Mom had leveraged her dermatology practice's relationships to get Jessica favorable evaluations from physicians who owed them professional favors. Our parents weren't just emotionally invested in Jessica's success, they were actively manipulating the system to ensure it. Marcus had overheard a conversation between Jessica and another student where she casually mentioned how our parents had handled various academic problems throughout her medical school career. She spoke about their intervention as routine family support, apparently unaware that using professional influence to alter academic outcomes was highly unethical and potentially illegal. The conversation included references to Dad making phone calls to department heads, Mom arranging private meetings with clinical supervisors, and both parents making financial donations to specific programs that just happened to benefit Jessica's academic progress. What I'd always seen as typical parental support was actually a systematic campaign of academic corruption. I spent days processing this information. The sister who'd been held up as the standard of achievement had been cutting corners and breaking rules throughout her entire academic career. The parents who'd lectured me about responsibility and good choices had been enablers of academic dishonesty and professional misconduct. But I was also deeply concerned about patient safety. If Jessica was stealing medications and falsifying records during her clinical rotations, people could be seriously harmed. Medical students have real responsibilities in hospital settings, and addiction combined with dishonesty created dangerous scenarios. I decided to reach out to Jessica directly. I called her and suggested we meet for coffee during one of her rare breaks from clinical rotations. She seemed surprised by my invitation. We rarely spoke one-on-one, but agreed to meet the following week. The Jessica I met that day was barely recognizable. She'd always been polished and confident, but now she looked exhausted, anxious, and oddly fragile. Her hand shook slightly when she picked up her coffee cup, and she seemed unable to maintain eye contact for more than a few seconds at a time. I approached the conversation carefully, starting with general questions about medical school stress and whether she felt overwhelmed by the pressure. She initially gave standard responses about the challenges being normal and manageable, but gradually began revealing more concerning details about her daily experience. She talked about feeling constantly behind, despite maintaining good grades. She described panic attacks before exams and clinical evaluations. She mentioned relying on study aids to maintain focus and energy, speaking about stimulant use like it was as normal as drinking coffee. When I pressed gently about whether she'd considered counseling or other support resources, Jessica's composure cracked. She began crying and admitted she felt trapped by everyone's expectations. She said the pressure to be perfect was crushing her, but she couldn't disappoint our parents after everything they'd invested in her success. That's when the full truth came out. Jessica revealed that she'd been struggling academically for over a year but had been covering it up with increasingly desperate measures. The medication theft was just the latest in a series of ethical compromises she'd made to maintain her perfect facade. She also confirmed Marcus's information about our parents' involvement, but with additional details that made their behavior even more problematic. They weren't just pulling strings occasionally. They were micromanaging her entire medical school experience, using their professional network to ensure she never faced real consequences for poor performance or misconduct. Jessica begged me not to tell anyone what she'd shared, claiming she was planning to get help after graduation. But I realized that waiting wasn't an option. Patient safety was at risk, and her addiction was escalating. More importantly, our parents' enabling behavior was preventing Jessica from experiencing the natural consequences that might motivate her to seek genuine help. That night, I made one of the hardest decisions of my life. I wasn't going to let patient safety be compromised to protect my family's reputation, and I wasn't going to enable the corruption that had poisoned Jessica's entire academic career. The Golden Child dynasty was built on lies, and it was time for the truth to come out. I spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with what to do about Jessica's confession. Every instinct told me to protect my sister, despite years of being overlooked in her favor. But Marcus's concerns about patient safety kept echoing in my mind, along with the realization that our parents' interference had prevented Jessica from ever learning from her mistakes or developing genuine professional competence. Finally, I made a decision that would change everything. I called Marcus and asked him to connect me with the appropriate people at Johns Hopkins. If Jessica was going to enter the medical profession, patients deserved to know she was competent and ethical. If she was struggling with addiction and academic dishonesty, she needed real intervention, not continued enabling from our parents. Marcus arranged for me to speak with Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the Associate Dean for Student Affairs, who oversaw professional conduct issues. Dr. Chen listened carefully as I explained my concerns about Jessica's behavior, her admission of medication theft, and our parents' inappropriate involvement in her academic progress. Dr. Chen was particularly interested in the details about parental interference. She explained that while family support was normal, using professional influence to alter academic outcomes violated multiple policies and potentially compromised educational integrity. She asked if I had any specific information about which faculty members or administrators had been contacted by our parents. I shared what Jessica had told me about Dad's phone calls to department heads and Mom's meetings with clinical supervisors. Dr. Chen took detailed notes and explained that they would need to investigate these claims thoroughly. She also mentioned that if the allegations were substantiated, it could affect not just Jessica's standing but potentially implicate faculty members who had improperly responded to outside pressure. The next day, Dr. Chen called to schedule a formal interview. Johns Hopkins was launching an internal investigation into academic integrity violations and potential professional misconduct. They wanted me to provide a detailed statement about everything Jessica had told me, plus any additional information I might have about our parents' involvement. The interview was intense but thorough. Dr. Chen was joined by another administrator and a representative from the university's legal department. They asked specific questions about dates, times, and circumstances of conversations with Jessica. They wanted to know exactly what our parents had said about their involvement and whether I had any documentation or witnesses to support the allegations. I felt terrible about potentially destroying Jessica's career, but Dr. Chen helped me understand that patients' lives could literally depend on ensuring medical professionals were competent and ethical. She also pointed out that untreated addiction in healthcare settings posed serious risks not just to patients but to Jessica herself. Within a week, the investigation expanded beyond anything I'd anticipated. Johns Hopkins began reviewing Jessica's entire academic record, examining her clinical evaluations, and interviewing faculty members who'd worked with her. They also started investigating our parents' alleged interference, which required contacting physicians and administrators who might have been inappropriately influenced. The investigation revealed problems that went far beyond what Jessica had admitted to me. Academic records showed a pattern of inconsistent performance that had been systematically covered up through grade changes, do-over examinations, and favorable evaluations that didn't match actual clinical observations. Several faculty members admitted they'd been contacted by our father and had felt pressured to give Jessica special consideration. More seriously, pharmacy records revealed that Jessica had been stealing medications for much longer than she'd admitted, possibly dating back to her first clinical rotations 2 years earlier. The investigation also uncovered falsified patient records and documented cases where she'd claimed responsibility for procedures she hadn't actually performed. Dr. Chen called me with updates throughout the investigation, partly because my testimony was crucial to their case and partly because she felt I deserved to know how serious the situation had become. She explained that Jessica was facing potential expulsion from medical school, criminal charges for drug theft, and permanent exclusion from medical licensing. But the investigation had also revealed something that made me question everything I thought I knew about my family. Our parents' involvement wasn't just inappropriate advocacy, it was systematic corruption that had been going on for years. Dad had made substantial financial contributions to specific departments immediately before Jessica's grades were mysteriously improved. Mom had arranged favorable clinical placements for Jessica through professional relationships that involved implicit quid pro quo arrangements. The university's legal team was considering whether our parents' behavior constituted fraud, academic bribery, or other criminal activity. They'd essentially purchased Jessica's academic success through a combination of financial influence and professional pressure, undermining the integrity of medical education and potentially putting future patients at risk. 3 weeks into the investigation, Jessica was suspended from all clinical activities pending the outcome of the inquiry. She called me crying, begging me to somehow undo what I'd started. She claimed she was planning to get help for her addiction after graduation and that I'd destroyed her career for no reason. But Dr. Chen had shared enough details about the investigation for me to understand that Jessica's problems were far more serious than occasional stimulant use. She'd been stealing controlled substances, falsifying medical records, and performing medical procedures she wasn't qualified to handle. Patients had been put at risk because our parents had enabled behavior that should have resulted in immediate removal from clinical settings. Jessica also revealed that our parents had hired a high-powered attorney and were threatening to sue Johns Hopkins for targeting their daughter. They were claiming the investigation was discriminatory and that Jessica was being scapegoated for systemic problems in medical education. They apparently had no intention of acknowledging any wrongdoing and were prepared to fight the charges aggressively. This was when I realized that our parents would never accept responsibility for their role in creating this situation. They'd spent so many years protecting Jessica from consequences that they couldn't recognize when their intervention had become destructive. They were more concerned about preserving their image as parents of a successful doctor than ensuring Jessica got the help she needed or protecting patient safety. The attorney our parents hired began investigating how the university had learned about Jessica's problems, apparently trying to discredit the investigation by attacking its origins. Dr. Chen warned me that I might be contacted by their legal team and should consider getting my own attorney if they tried to pressure or intimidate me. I realized that by coming forward, I'd started a process that was going to expose everything our family had hidden for years. Jessica's graduation was just 6 weeks away, and our parents were planning elaborate celebrations for their perfect daughter. They had no idea that their golden child was facing potential criminal charges and that their own behavior was under investigation for academic fraud. The truth was finally coming out, but it was going to destroy the family mythology that had defined us for decades. I was about to learn whether my parents valued integrity over image, and whether they would choose accountability over continuing to protect Jessica from the consequences of her actions. 2 weeks before Jessica's scheduled graduation, the situation exploded in ways none of us had anticipated. Dr. Chen called me with news that would fundamentally alter our family's future. Johns Hopkins had completed their investigation and made decisions that would have permanent consequences for everyone involved. Jessica was being expelled from medical school, effective immediately. She would not be graduating, would not receive her medical degree, and would be permanently barred from reapplying to any medical program affiliated with Johns Hopkins. The university was also reporting her conduct to the Association of American Medical Colleges, which would likely prevent her from being accepted to medical schools anywhere in the country. But the consequences extended far beyond Jessica's academic career. The investigation had uncovered evidence of systematic corruption involving our parents that Johns Hopkins was referring to federal authorities. Dad's financial contributions coinciding with Jessica's grade improvements constituted potential academic bribery. Mom's use of professional relationships to secure favorable evaluations violated multiple medical ethics guidelines and potentially criminal statutes. The university was also pursuing civil remedies, seeking to recover financial damages related to Jessica's fraudulent academic performance and our parents' corrupt influence. They were calculating costs associated with falsified clinical training, wasted educational resources, and potential liability for patients who'd been treated by an unqualified student. Dr. Chen explained that this case was unprecedented in Johns Hopkins history. While they'd dealt with individual instances of academic dishonesty, the systematic nature of the corruption and parental involvement made it a landmark case that would likely result in policy changes for medical schools nationwide. The federal investigation was being handled by the Department of Education's Office of Inspector General, which deals with educational fraud and corruption. Our parents were facing potential charges of mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit educational fraud. If convicted, they could face significant prison time and be required to pay substantial financial penalties. But none of us knew about these developments yet. Our parents were still planning Jessica's graduation celebration, apparently convinced that their attorney would resolve everything quietly. They'd sent invitations to extended family, made restaurant reservations, and arranged for a photographer to document their daughter's achievement. I faced an impossible decision. Should I warn them about what was coming, potentially giving them time to prepare legal defenses or destroy evidence? Should I stay silent and let them discover the truth when federal agents showed up at their door? Or should I attend the graduation ceremony and watch the entire charade unfold publicly? The irony wasn't lost on me that they'd planned this celebration without inviting me to participate meaningfully. I was expected to attend and smile while they celebrated Jessica's success, but I wasn't included in any of the planning or preparation. They still saw me as a supporting character in Jessica's story, unaware that I'd become the protagonist in a completely different narrative. Jessica had been avoiding my calls since learning about the investigation, but she finally contacted me 3 days before the ceremony. She was desperate, alternating between rage and pleading, trying to convince me to somehow fix what I'd caused. She claimed she'd been planning to address her problems after graduation and that I'd destroyed her life for no reason. During that conversation, Jessica revealed something that made the entire situation even more disturbing. She admitted that our parents had known about her addiction for months and had been helping her hide it. Dad had been providing her with prescription stimulants from his medical practice, essentially enabling her drug use while helping her avoid getting caught by hospital drug screening programs. Mom had been coaching Jessica on how to manipulate clinical evaluations and had provided detailed information about which faculty members could be influenced through professional relationships. Our parents weren't just passively supporting Jessica. They were actively participating in the deception that had corrupted her entire medical education. This revelation fundamentally changed how I viewed our family dynamic. The favoritism I'd experienced wasn't just emotional preference. It was willingness to commit crimes to ensure Jessica's success. Our parents had risked their own professional licenses, legal standing, and ethical reputations to protect their golden child from experiencing any real challenges or consequences. Jessica also confirmed what I'd suspected about their reaction to the investigation. They were furious that anyone had dared to question Jessica's qualifications or their parenting decisions. They viewed the entire situation as persecution rather than accountability, and they were preparing to fight aggressively to protect their family's reputation. But they still didn't know that I was the source of the investigation. Jessica hadn't told them about our coffee conversation or her confession about medication theft. They apparently assumed the investigation had resulted from routine monitoring or jealous colleagues targeting their successful daughter. This gave me information they didn't have and power they couldn't anticipate. I knew exactly what evidence existed against them, what charges they were likely to face, and how thoroughly their entire family mythology was about to be exposed. They were walking into their carefully planned graduation celebration completely unprepared for the reality that was about to destroy everything they'd built. I made a decision that felt both terrible and necessary. I would attend the graduation ceremony, not to celebrate Jessica's fake achievement, but to witness the moment when truth finally overcame years of lies and corruption. I wanted to see their faces when they realized that their golden child's success was built on crime and that their perfect family image was about to crumble publicly. The morning of graduation, I received one final call from Dr. Chen. Federal agents would be serving warrants immediately after the ceremony, arresting Jessica for drug theft and fraud while simultaneously serving our parents with notices that they were under federal investigation. The timing was deliberately chosen to maximize the public exposure and send a clear message about consequences for academic corruption. Dr. Chen also informed me that Johns Hopkins had decided to make this case public as part of their commitment to transparency and accountability. They would be issuing press releases about the investigation and holding a news conference to discuss policy changes resulting from the case. Our family's crimes were going to become national news in the medical education community. As I got dressed for graduation, I reflected on the strange turn my life had taken. 6 months earlier, I'd been the overlooked daughter attending family events where I felt invisible. Now I was about to attend my sister's graduation ceremony knowing that she wouldn't actually be graduating and that federal agents were waiting to arrest her. The family that had always made me feel inadequate was about to discover that their definition of success was built on lies, crimes, and corruption. The parents who'd lectured me about responsibility and good choices were about to be exposed as criminals who'd violated every principle they claimed to value. I arrived at the graduation venue early, choosing a seat where I could observe both the ceremony and my family's reactions. I watched our parents arrive in their finest clothes, beaming with pride and greeting other families with the confidence of people celebrating genuine achievement. They had no idea that within hours, their perfect world would be completely destroyed. Jessica looked nervous but was trying to maintain her usual confident facade. She was wearing her graduation regalia and posing for photos with our parents, playing her role in what would be the final performance of our family's elaborate deception. The ceremony was about to begin, and I was the only person in that auditorium who knew how it was really going to end. The Johns Hopkins Medical School graduation ceremony began exactly as our parents had imagined, with pomp, circumstance, and the promise of celebrating their golden child's greatest achievement. 500 guests filled the auditorium, families beaming with pride as their children prepared to become doctors. Our parents sat in the front section reserved for families of graduates, radiating satisfaction as they prepared to watch Jessica receive her medical degree. I sat 3 rows behind them, watching the elaborate ceremony unfold while knowing it was all a performance. Jessica's name was still listed in the graduation program, even though university administrators knew she wouldn't actually be receiving a degree. They'd decided to let the ceremony proceed normally to avoid disrupting other families' celebrations, but federal agents were waiting outside to arrest her immediately afterward. The dean began calling names alphabetically, and I watched our parents' excitement build as they anticipated Jessica's moment. Dad had his professional camera ready, while Mom was practically vibrating with anticipation. They'd waited 4 years for this validation of their parenting and financial investment, completely unaware that their daughter's entire medical career was built on lies. When they reached the M section of the alphabet, something unexpected happened. Instead of calling Jessica's name, the dean paused and announced that several graduates were unable to participate in the ceremony due to administrative matters but that their families should remain seated for a special announcement after the degree presentations. Our parents looked confused but not alarmed, they assumed this was some minor bureaucratic delay that would be resolved quickly. Jessica, however, turned pale and began fidgeting nervously in her seat with the other graduates. She knew exactly what administrative matters meant, and she could see her carefully constructed world beginning to collapse. The ceremony continued without Jessica's name being called. Our parents spent the next hour growing increasingly agitated, whispering to each other and craning their necks to see if there had been some mistake. Other families around them began offering sympathetic looks, assuming Jessica was experiencing some minor graduation delay. When the last degree was awarded and graduates began moving their tassels, our parents were openly distressed. Dad stood up and started walking toward the stage area, apparently planning to demand answers about why Jessica hadn't been called. Mom followed, her face flushed with embarrassment and confusion. That's when Dean Patricia Hoffman took the microphone for the special announcement that would destroy our family's reputation forever. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, Johns Hopkins University is committed to maintaining the highest standards of academic and professional integrity. Unfortunately, we must inform you that several individuals who were scheduled to graduate today have been found to have violated fundamental principles of medical education and professional ethics. The auditorium fell silent. Parents who had been celebrating moments earlier now listened with growing concern as Dean Hoffman continued. These individuals engaged in systematic academic dishonesty, falsified clinical records, and committed theft of controlled substances from hospital facilities. Their actions compromised patient safety and violated the trust that patients place in medical professionals. Our parents froze halfway down the aisle, suddenly understanding that this announcement was about Jessica. Other families began looking around, trying to identify which graduates were being discussed. The festive atmosphere evaporated as people realized they were witnessing an unprecedented public exposure of medical school corruption. Furthermore, Dean Hoffman continued, our investigation revealed that family members of these individuals used professional influence and financial pressure to manipulate academic outcomes. This behavior constitutes fraud and academic bribery, undermining the integrity of medical education. Now our parents were the center of attention as people began recognizing them as the family mentioned in the announcement. Dad's face turned red with rage and embarrassment, while Mom looked like she was about to faint. They were trapped in the middle of the aisle, unable to escape the hundreds of eyes now focused on them. Federal authorities are currently pursuing criminal charges against both the individuals involved and their family members. Johns Hopkins University is cooperating fully with these investigations and has implemented new policies to prevent similar corruption in the future. The auditorium erupted in shocked murmurs as families processed what they'd just heard. Some people were taking photos and videos of our parents, recognizing this as a historic moment in medical education. Others were expressing outrage that criminal activity had contaminated what should have been a sacred celebration of medical achievement. Our parents finally found their voices, and what happened next would be seared into the memory of everyone present. Dad began screaming at Dean Hoffman, demanding to know how she dared to slander his daughter and threatening lawsuits for defamation. Mom was sobbing and shouting that this was all a misunderstanding that their attorney would resolve. You people don't know what you're talking about. Dad yelled, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium. My daughter is brilliant and worked harder than anyone here. You're jealous of her success and trying to destroy her career. Dean Hoffman remained calm as security officers moved toward our parents. Sir, I understand this is distressing, but Jessica Morrison has been expelled from medical school for academic fraud, drug theft, and professional misconduct. Federal agents are waiting to arrest her for criminal charges. That's when Mom screamed the words that would define our family's legacy, this is all Sarah's fault. She's always been jealous of Jessica and she's destroying our family out of spite. 500 people turned to look at me as Mom pointed in my direction. In that moment, our parents publicly blamed me for their own criminal behavior, choosing to scapegoat their overlooked daughter rather than accept responsibility for enabling Jessica's corruption. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of hundreds of stares, and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, I reported Jessica's drug theft and academic fraud because patients deserve doctors who are competent and ethical. I reported your bribery and corruption because medical education should be based on merit, not criminal influence. The auditorium exploded with shocked gasps and excited whispers. Our parents had just admitted publicly that I was the whistleblower who'd exposed their crimes, and I'd confirmed that their golden child's success was built on systematic fraud. You ungrateful little bitch. Dad screamed at me across the auditorium. We should have disowned you years ago. You've destroyed this family. We disown you. Mom shrieked, her voice breaking with rage and hysteria. You are no longer our daughter. Get out of our lives." Security officers reached our parents at that moment, escorting them out of the auditorium as they continued screaming threats and accusations. Jessica was simultaneously being led away by federal agents who'd entered through a side door. The graduation ceremony had become a criminal arrest operation, and I was sitting in the middle of it all, finally free from a family that had never valued me properly. 500 witnesses had just seen our parents choose their criminal daughter over their honest one, and choose public denial over private accountability. The golden child dynasty was over, and I was the one who'd brought it down. The chaos following the graduation ceremony was unlike anything Johns Hopkins had ever experienced. Videos of our parents screaming at Dean Hoffman and publicly disowning me went viral within hours, spreading across social media platforms and medical education forums nationwide. The footage of Dad calling me an ungrateful little bitch and Mom shrieking that they were disowning me became a case study in how not to handle family crisis. But the public spectacle was just the beginning of consequences that would reshape our family forever. Within 24 hours of graduation day, federal agents had arrested Jessica on charges of drug theft, mail fraud, and conspiracy to commit educational fraud. Our parents were simultaneously served with federal indictments for academic bribery, conspiracy, and wire fraud related to their systematic corruption of Jessica's medical education. The media coverage was extensive and devastating to their reputations. Local news stations ran stories about the medical school graduation scandal featuring photos of our parents being escorted out of the ceremony by security. National medical journals covered the case as an unprecedented example of family-enabled academic corruption that had compromised patient safety and educational integrity. Dr. Patricia Chen called me the day after graduation to provide updates on the criminal proceedings and thank me for my courage in coming forward. She explained that my testimony had been crucial to building the federal case, and that the public exposure during graduation had sent a powerful message about consequences for academic fraud. But Dr. Chen also shared information that made the situation even more disturbing than I'd realized. The federal investigation had uncovered evidence that our parents' corruption extended far beyond Jessica's medical school experience. They'd been manipulating her academic outcomes since high school, using financial donations and professional influence to ensure she received grades and opportunities she hadn't actually earned. The investigation revealed that Jessica's acceptance to Johns Hopkins had been facilitated by a substantial donation Dad made to the university's cardiac surgery program, timed precisely with her application submission. Her undergraduate transcript showed unexplained grade changes that coincided with financial contributions our parents made to specific departments. The pattern of corruption went back nearly a decade. Even more shocking was what investigators found about Jessica's actual academic abilities. When removed from the system of parental manipulation and corruption, her performance was mediocre at best. Standardized test scores that couldn't be influenced through donations or connections revealed significant gaps in her medical knowledge. Clinical supervisors who hadn't been pressured by our parents provided honest evaluations showing Jessica was unprepared for independent medical practice. The golden child who'd been held up as proof of superior genetics and parenting was actually an average student whose entire academic career had been purchased through systematic fraud. Everything our parents had bragged about, her grades, her research opportunities, her clinical achievements, was contaminated by corruption that had prevented her from developing genuine competence. 3 weeks after graduation, I received an unexpected visitor at my Denver apartment. Jessica had been released on bail and had apparently driven across the country to confront me personally. She looked terrible. Gaunt, exhausted, and desperate in ways that made me almost feel sorry for her despite everything she'd done. "You destroyed my entire life," she said when I opened the door. "I was going to get help after graduation. I was going to fix everything. But you couldn't wait, you had to destroy me immediately." I invited her in, curious about what she hoped to accomplish with this visit. As we sat in my living room, Jessica began revealing details about our family that I'd never suspected. She admitted that the pressure to be perfect had been crushing her since childhood, but that our parents had made it clear that failure wasn't an option. "You don't understand what it was like," she said, crying. Every achievement had to be bigger than the last one. Every grade had to be perfect. Every opportunity had to be seized. When I started struggling in college, Mom and Dad made it clear that disappointing them wasn't acceptable. Jessica explained that the corruption had started small, Dad making a phone call to a professor about a grade dispute, Mom arranging for Jessica to meet influential physicians who could provide opportunities. But it had escalated over time as Jessica's natural abilities failed to meet their expectations. I never asked them to bribe anyone, she insisted. I never asked them to steal from me. But once it started, I couldn't stop it without admitting that I wasn't actually as brilliant as everyone thought. The whole family identity was built around me being exceptional. This conversation helped me understand something crucial about our family dynamic. Jessica hadn't been the willing architect of her own privilege, she'd been trapped in a system of corruption that our parents had created to maintain their image as successful parents. The pressure to be perfect had driven her to addiction and academic fraud, while their enabling had prevented her from developing genuine resilience or competence. But understanding the psychology didn't change the consequences. Patients had been put at risk by Jessica's incompetence. Medical education had been corrupted by our parents' bribes. Other qualified students had been denied opportunities that were purchased for Jessica through fraud. Jessica's visit also revealed the current state of our parents' situation. They'd hired expensive criminal defense attorneys and were fighting the charges aggressively, claiming they were being persecuted for advocating for their daughter. They apparently still believed they'd done nothing wrong and that the entire investigation was motivated by jealousy and discrimination. Their marriage was falling apart under the stress of criminal charges and public humiliation. Mom was blaming Dad for being too aggressive in his corruption efforts, while Dad was blaming Mom for not being supportive enough of Jessica's career. They were turning on each other rather than accepting responsibility for their choices. The financial consequences were devastating them as well. Dad's medical practice was losing patients who didn't want to be associated with criminal corruption. Mom's dermatology practice was facing similar reputation damage. They'd spent their life savings on legal fees and were likely to lose their house to pay restitution and fines. Jessica begged me to somehow help them, to provide character testimony or financial support during their legal battles. She claimed that our parents' lives were being destroyed over mistakes they'd made trying to help their daughter succeed. I looked at this woman who'd been the center of our family's universe for 26 years and felt a mixture of pity and resolve. Jessica, I said quietly, you're asking me to help the people who publicly disowned me rather than accept responsibility for their crimes. You want me to support a family that never supported me, to show loyalty to people who showed me none. You're still our family, she pleaded. Blood is thicker than water. Actually, I replied, the full saying is the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. It means that chosen relationships based on shared values are stronger than biological relationships based on accident of birth. You and our parents taught me that lesson very clearly. Jessica left that evening empty-handed, and I never saw her again. But her visit had given me closure about our family dynamic and confirmed that I'd made the right choice in exposing their corruption. They were still unable to accept responsibility, still expecting me to fix problems they'd created, still prioritizing image over integrity. The trial would begin in 6 months, and I was prepared to testify about everything I'd witnessed and learned. The family that had never valued my voice would finally have to listen to it in a federal courtroom, where truth mattered more than reputation and where justice would finally be served. The federal trial of my parents and Jessica became a landmark case in medical education law, drawing attention from universities, legal scholars, and medical professionals nationwide. Over the course of 3 weeks, prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of systematic academic corruption that had compromised medical education and potentially endangered patients. I testified for 2 days, detailing everything I'd witnessed about our family dynamic, Jessica's confession about drug theft and academic fraud, and our parents' pattern of using professional influence to manipulate her academic outcomes. The defense attorneys tried to portray me as a vindictive daughter motivated by jealousy, but the evidence spoke for itself. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Dad was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison plus $500,000 in fines and restitution. Mom received 3 years plus $300,000 in penalties. Jessica was sentenced to 2 years in prison and permanent prohibition from pursuing medical licensure in any state. But the criminal convictions were just the beginning of their consequences. The medical boards in both Maryland and California revoked our parents' medical licenses permanently, ending careers they'd spent decades building. Johns Hopkins published a detailed case study about the corruption, ensuring that their names would be permanently associated with academic fraud in medical education literature. The civil lawsuits were equally devastating. Other medical students who'd been denied opportunities that were given to Jessica filed suit for educational discrimination. Patients who'd been treated by Jessica during her clinical rotation sued for medical malpractice and fraudulent treatment. The financial penalties ultimately exceeded $2 million, forcing our parents into bankruptcy. 6 months after their sentencing, I received a letter from Dad written from federal prison. Unlike his previous attempts at manipulation, this letter contained what appeared to be genuine remorse and self-reflection. He acknowledged that their favoritism had damaged our family and that their corruption had compromised everything they claimed to value about medical ethics and professional integrity. I understand now that we lost the daughter who had actual integrity while trying to protect the one whose success was built on lies, he wrote. We created a system that harmed Jessica more than it helped her, and we destroyed our relationship with the daughter who could have actually made us proud through honest achievement. Mom's letter, which arrived a week later, was more focused on the impact their choices had on Jessica. She finally acknowledged that their enabling had prevented Jessica from developing genuine resilience and competence. She expressed regret about the pressure they'd put on Jessica to be perfect and the corruption they'd used to maintain that facade. Both letters included apologies for their treatment of me over the years, acknowledgement that they'd failed as parents in fundamental ways, and requests for eventual forgiveness. They weren't asking for immediate reconciliation, but hoping that someday we might be able to rebuild some kind of relationship based on honesty rather than manipulation. I was surprised to find that their apologies affected me more than I'd expected. For years, I'd wanted validation that their treatment was wrong and acknowledgement of my worth as their daughter. Receiving that validation felt both satisfying and deeply sad. It had taken federal prison sentences for them to recognize what should have been obvious all along. Jessica's letter was the most complex to process. She'd used her time in prison to get clean from stimulant addiction and participate in therapy programs that helped her understand the psychology behind her academic fraud. She wrote about finally recognizing how the pressure to be perfect had driven her to compromise her values and endanger patients. I realize now that I was never actually successful, she wrote. Everything I achieved was purchased through corruption, and I never developed real competence or resilience. The golden child you watched get all the attention was actually a fraud who was too weak to handle real challenges. She also apologized for the years of dismissive treatment and for her role in maintaining family dynamics that had marginalized me. She acknowledged that I'd shown more courage and integrity by exposing their crimes than she'd ever shown in her entire academic career. 3 years have passed since graduation day, and my life has transformed in ways I never could have imagined. My business has expanded internationally, I've been featured in marketing industry publications, and I've built relationships based on mutual respect rather than conditional approval. I started a foundation that provides scholarships for first-generation college students pursuing careers in healthcare, ensuring that medical education opportunities go to students who've earned them through merit rather than purchased them through corruption. The foundation is funded partly through the civil settlement money I received as a whistleblower reward for exposing federal crimes. Most importantly, I've learned what healthy family relationships actually look like through David's family, who welcomed me completely and showed me what unconditional love means. We married last year in a ceremony filled with people who value integrity over image and choose authenticity over performance. I maintain limited contact with my biological family through letters, but I haven't seen them in person since graduation day. Their apologies were meaningful, but rebuilding trust requires consistent demonstration of changed behavior over time. They're making progress in therapy and working to understand how their choices affected everyone involved, but recovery from decades of toxic family dynamics is a slow process. The most beautiful part of this story isn't their downfall, it's discovering that I never needed their approval to build an extraordinary life. The daughter they overlooked became the woman with enough integrity to choose justice over family loyalty when those values conflicted. The family scapegoat became the only family member who maintained ethical standards when tested. Final call to action: what would you have done in my situation? Stayed silent to protect family relationships, or risked everything to ensure patient safety and educational integrity? Have you ever had to choose between loyalty to toxic family members and your own moral principles? How do you balance forgiveness with accountability when dealing with people who've consistently harmed you? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button. It helps other people find these real-life family drama stories that show the power of choosing integrity over image. Don't forget to subscribe for more jaw-dropping tales of family dysfunction, justice served, and the courage it takes to do the right thing even when it costs everything. Share this video with anyone who's ever been the overlooked child in a toxic family system or struggled with the choice between family loyalty and moral principles. Sometimes we need to hear stories about people who chose integrity over approval to find the courage to make difficult but necessary decisions in our own lives. Thank you for listening to my story and for supporting content that explores the complex dynamics of family relationships and personal integrity. I hope my experience reminds you that you're never obligated to enable other people's harmful behavior, even when those people are family members who claim to love you. Remember, true family relationships are built on mutual respect, honesty, and accountability. Blood relations that lack these foundations aren't worth preserving at the expense of your own integrity and well-being. Choose relationships that honor the person you truly are, and never compromise your values to maintain connections with people who don't value you properly. Until next time, keep choosing truth over comfort, integrity over approval, and authentic relationships over toxic family obligations.